Welcome to episode 2. The title of this episode is The First 6 Months. If episode 1 asked whether you should begin a doctorate, episode 2 asks a different question. Why does everything suddenly feel so different? One thing that still surprises me is how quickly people realize that doctoral study is unlike any educational experience they have previously encountered. Nothing is necessarily wrong, but everything often feels unfamiliar. This episode is about understanding why, and that starts by briefly looking back at where we've come from. This slide reminds us of the question we explored in episode 1. Should you even do a PhD? Now the question changes. What exactly have I signed up for? That is a very natural progression. I have lost count of the number of times students have told me that they understood the decision to start a doctorate, but did not fully understand the experience itself. And that experience often begins with a period of adjustment, which is exactly where we are now. This slide reminds us where you are. The first 6 months are often confusing. Most students expect clarity and encounter uncertainty. One thing I wish more students understood is that confusion during this period is often perfectly normal. You are simultaneously learning about your topic, your supervisor, your institution, and yourself. That is a lot to process, and it often creates an uncomfortable feeling that many people interpret incorrectly, which brings us naturally to the shock of transition. This slide introduces something almost everybody experiences. Past success does not automatically prepare you for doctoral study. This can be a very uncomfortable realization. I remember one student saying to me, "I've always been good at education, so why does this suddenly feel difficult?" It was a very honest question. The answer was simple. The rules had changed. Doctoral study is a different type of challenge, and that often leads directly to the next problem. Nobody gives you a map. This slide captures one of the biggest adjustments people make. Research rarely provides clear instructions or fixed pathways. This can initially feel unsettling. Most previous education experiences reward certainty. Doctoral study rewards judgment. I've lost count of the number of times students have asked me, "Can you just tell me the right answer?" Often there is no single right answer. There are better answers, more defensible answers, more appropriate answers, but certainty itself is often unavailable. And this requires a different way of thinking. This slide introduces a major shift in identity. You're becoming an independent researcher and creator of knowledge. That sounds exciting. It also feels intimidating. One pattern that still surprises me is how many students continue thinking like consumers of knowledge long after beginning their doctorate. That is entirely understandable. It takes time to adjust, but gradually the relationship changes. You begin contributing rather than simply consuming. And that transition affects another important relationship, your supervisor relationship. This slide addresses an important reality. The supervisor relationship is a partnership, not a dependency. I'm very pleased this slide exists, because there is often an assumption that good supervision removes uncertainty. It does not. Good supervision helps you navigate uncertainty. I've supervised many excellent students over the years. The strongest relationships were partnerships. Both parties had responsibilities, and this is why managing expectations becomes so important. This slide introduces several conversations that should happen early. Meetings, feedback, communication, authorship, independence. One thing I wish more students understood is that many future frustrations can be reduced by discussing expectations early. I've seen small misunderstandings gradually become large frustrations, simply because nobody had the conversation at the beginning. Clarity early often creates confidence later. And another thing that can undermine confidence is comparison. This slide addresses a trap that many doctoral candidates experience. Every doctorate develops differently. Comparison often creates unnecessary anxiety. I've lost count of the number of times students have said, "Everybody else seems further ahead than me." In my experience, that assumption is almost always wrong. You rarely see the full picture of somebody else's doctorate. You see selected moments. Comparison often distorts reality, and comparison frequently increases another feature of doctoral life: uncertainty. This slide may be one of the most important in the episode. Uncertainty about topic, methods, findings, and progress is normal. Notice that the slide says normal, not exceptional, normal. One thing I've become more certain about over the years is this: the doctorate is not teaching you how to eliminate uncertainty. It is teaching you how to function despite uncertainty. That is a very different skill. And when people struggle with uncertainty, certain warning signs often begin to appear. I think this may be my favourite slide in the episode. Confusion is not always incompetence. Sometimes it is evidence of growth. One pattern that still surprises me is how quickly intelligent people interpret confusion as failure. Often the opposite is true. The reason things feel difficult is because you're learning something genuinely new. Growth and uncertainty often arrive together, and perhaps that is why the next reflection questions matter so much. This slide asks two very important questions. What expectations did I bring into the PhD? What assumptions have already been challenged? I would encourage you to spend genuine time thinking about these, because almost everybody arrives carrying assumptions from previous educational experiences. Some assumptions survive, others do not. And speaking of the future, let's briefly look ahead. This slide introduces episode 3, Finding and Refining Your Research Question. One thing that still surprises me is how often students assume the perfect research question exists from the beginning. In reality, good research questions often evolve over time. Episode 3 explores that process. But before we finish, I would like to briefly acknowledge the references behind this episode. This slide introduces several excellent references. These texts explain the visible doctorate extremely well. This program is also trying to explain the lived doctorate. Both perspectives are important, and that brings us to our final thought. This final slide summarizes the first 6 months beautifully. The goal is not certainty. The goal is adaptation. I would perhaps go one step further. The goal is not to become comfortable because things are certain. The goal is to become comfortable because you're learning how to adapt. And that may be one of the most important lessons the first 6 months will teach you. Thank you for joining me for episode 2. Remember, nothing is wrong if things currently feel uncertain. In many ways, uncertainty is evidence that the journey has genuinely begun. I look forward to seeing you in episode 3.